President Cyril Ramaphosa says South Africa stands to play an important role in the green hydrogen value chain. Ramaphosa says this will also assist in driving industrialization across major sectors. We're now joined by Dr. Sean Muller, Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Doc, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. So just as we're trying to wrap our heads around the jargon around the just energy transition, renewable energies and the explanations behind that, we've got green hydrogen, which is set to be a game changer for not only South Africa but the continent. What is it?
Well, yes, it is notionally a game changer. I think we can get into the question of whether it's going to be or not. Hydrogen is a source of energy in certain sectors, like transport, that are not so easily electrified, as it were. And green hydrogen is a way of producing hydrogen that is more, shall we say, environmentally friendly, particularly in relation to atmospheric change. So green hydrogen production uses renewable energy. That's how you can understand the contextualization of this. So first of all, it uses renewable energy to produce the hydrogen that is then used in other sectors. And furthermore, it serves as a means of storing energy from renewable energy generation. And storage is one of the big, affordable and efficient storage is one of the big challenges for renewable energy in general. So that's kind of the role that various policymakers and international bodies see green hydrogen playing in the context of the just transition.
So you agree it's going to be a game changer? How?
Oh no, I don't necessarily agree that it's going to be a game changer. I do think it's important. I think it's something that governments and industries should be looking into, and various other countries are already further ahead than South Africa in this area. I think it's true that South Africa does have resources that place it relatively well in terms of pursuing the production of green hydrogen. But I think the hype around it exceeds its importance, especially for countries like South Africa. Ultimately, as I've said before in our interviews about renewable energy and the just transition, the key, in my view, to whether the transition that takes place, if it takes place, is financing. And the financing issues have not in any way been resolved in terms of the financing across countries. So whether less wealthy countries are going to be paying for their own transitions, or the degree to which wealthier and historically more polluting countries will be assisting with those payments, and whether that will be in the form of grants or loans, and also who's going to pay within countries. And as I've said before, the current trajectory, and even now with the recent COP meeting, the current trajectory is still such that I think less wealthy countries are being pushed to transition too quickly, to pay for too much of the transition themselves. And furthermore, in countries like South Africa, the costs are being shifted away from elites and onto what one might call ordinary South Africans. So, none of those issues are resolved by the green hydrogen issue. It's partly also an attempt to address concerns about job creation and loss of jobs in traditional dirty energy producing sectors. And in that regard also I should say that very often in my experience, pretty much in every case, the kinds of economic impact assessments and job projections that we see with these kinds of projects and proposals are pretty much always exaggerated.
So, Doc, staying on the financing question, where will the money come from? So, President Cyril Ramaphosa in Cape Town highlighted that the green hydrogen is identified in the investment plan as one of the 4 big frontiers of a just energy transition. Now, that just energy transition, as we understand it, the President also outlining that South Africa needs approximately 1.6 trillion rand over the next 5 years. And so when you question the financing of it, we understand since COP27 that there's a number of countries that have pledged money towards South Africa transitioning, but the finer detail is something that is still missing. Should that concern us as South Africans?
It should definitely concern all of us as South Africans. There was a lot of hype when after the last COP meeting, there was an announcement that South Africa, at the very beginning, South Africa was going to be given funding, and very soon it turned out that the terms at best weren't clear, and at worst they were quite unfavorable. Again, in the broader context, historical context, current global context, in terms of which countries have the resources and what they're doing with their own hydrocarbons. As I've said before, countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and so forth, the UK, have been exploiting their own hydrocarbons, the US in particular, but these same countries are funding initiatives to push countries like South Africa to stop trying to exploit, for example, natural gas resources. And green hydrogen is also being used within that context, right? So that's the thing. There are good reasons for governments and industries to be pursuing the development of green hydrogen. But for example, some individuals who are linked to vested interests have tried to use green hydrogen also as an argument for blocking natural gas use and exploration, because they say, well, if you develop natural gas resources now, then that'll weaken the case for green hydrogen in the future. Well, okay, yes, but who's going to pay for less wealthy countries like South Africa to forego the use of natural gas resources, right? And that links to the financing question, because these other countries are getting revenue from hydrocarbons that they can then use to fund also part of the green energy transition. But if South Africa deprives itself of resources from hydrocarbons, and at the same time the kind of funding that it's getting from these wealthy countries is at best like concessional loans, it's not even grants, then it's going to run into a real financing problem. That's going to happen down the line when a lot of these vested interests have already secured significant profits, and the individuals, these not so independent experts who sometimes are commenting in the media, they've already taken off their benefits and they've retired. And then the rest of us will be left, with the consequences of an inadequate energy system, and a highly costly one at that, where the costs are being pushed on to South Africans who can actually least afford it.
Yeah, Doc, so much has been said about the 9 wasted years, state capture, etc., etc. And so to guard against best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, to guard against South Africa being exploited and the everyday South African being exploited again. What then is it that you and I can do? As we understand it, the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan is open for public comment. Are we as South Africans involved in the processes, as we are good at being enraged and being very vocal about that rage?
Well, I think it's difficult for so-called ordinary South Africans. Myself as an academic, I often have more time. I have time to read the documents. I maybe have time or can find time to make submissions to Parliament and so forth. And I've made a number of submissions also with a co-author of mine. And my general sense is that a lot of this it's going through the motions. The Constitution requires that the government goes through public consultation processes and so forth. Parliament has to go through consultation processes when legislation is passed. But when it comes to the financing thing, for example, there were already sort of announcements from the government as if this had also almost been decided. And then there's kind of walked back a bit when there's realization that, oh yes, we do have to consult. And I've said before, and some people don't like this, but I've said before that in some ways the dynamics that we're seeing are similar to the dynamics around what was referred to as like the controversial Russian nuclear deal. Because in that case, the strategy seemed to be to kind of tie the country's hands with these prior agreements, and then yes, you go through the process to get the approvals, but kind of the decisions have already been made. And my concern is that when it comes to financing, that's also what's happening. But I think there is still time from a legal point of view as well. There is still time to put pressure on the states to have a more substantive public consultation process, but also just to push on the question of what are the financing implications. I mentioned, I think in a previous interview, I raised this at a conference with somebody from the presidency, and their response was along the lines of, oh yeah, we should look into that. I mean, that's really not acceptable. We need to know what the financial implications are for the country 30 years down the line, because that's when current generations are going to be having to deal with the financing consequences. So, and that was also a feature of the Russian nuclear deal, which is basically that notionally this is supposedly how it's going to work, is that the Russian government would build the nuclear plants and then they'd reclaim the money through electricity tariffs later on. So, of course, the financing problem would arise when those electricity tariffs went incredibly high, and the government, of course, would have had to guarantee those. So it's these kinds of, and there's a different structure being used in the current case, and it's also linked to the changing of Eskom's debt, taking debt off Eskom's balance sheet onto the national balance sheet. There's a good case to be made for that, but again, my concern is that what's going to happen is it's going to be used in order to invest in an overly rapid and overly costly transition. And the costs will then be incurred later. So I think the government, policymakers, supposedly independent experts who don't declare their funding sources and so forth, these individuals need to be put under pressure to say, what are actually the financing implications? Why is this just? Don't just tell us about jobs in the coal fields. Yes, those are important. But tell us about the justness of the financing across countries and within countries. And maybe then we can make some progress.
Dr. Sean Muller is a Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you.